StarCraft, the legendary RTS that paved the way for competitive gaming, inspired an entire generation of esports, and left a lasting mark on the strategy genre. But more than a decade after StarCraft 2's Legacy of the Void, it makes you wonder, why is Activision Blizzard refusing to make StarCraft 2, or rather, what's stopping them? Blizzard, once the undisputed king of RTS, has been radio silent. No announcements, not even a cryptic teaser video with nothing to show. I'm looking at you, Bethesda.
16 times the detail.
Yeah, that was a low blow. At first glance, sitting on an IP this large and doing absolutely nothing to monetize it seems like a huge waste. Did Blizzard abandon one of its most beloved franchises? Today, we're looking into some of the reasons why StarCraft 3 isn't happening, or at least not anytime soon. Let's go ahead and start with the campaign and story. If you haven't finished StarCraft 2 in the decade that it's been out, spoiler alert ahead, I guess. Now, I'm not going to give a complete breakdown of the conclusion of the Legacy of the Void campaign. Rather, I want to go over some story beats that wrapped up the narrative Blizzard wanted to tell. And you'll see where I'm going with this. Towards the end of Legacy of the Void, during the conflict with Amon, Artanis eventually gets possessed by Amon himself due to retaining his nerve cords. This gave Amon full psychic access and control over his body and any other Protoss still tethered to the Khala. Zeratul, who is with Artanis at this point in time, is unbound by the Khala as a Dark Templar and remains out of Amon's reach. The cinematic progresses into what ultimately becomes a showdown between the two Protoss, and say what you want about the StarCraft 2 story, but these lines of dialogue are cold.
Your nerve cords chain you to his will. They must be removed.
An epic anime battle ensues as Zeratul attempts to break Artanis free from Amon's will and concludes with Zeratul sustaining a fatal wound at the end of their duel. Zeratul, however, did succeed in severing Artanis' nerve cords and is able to pass some final words to Artanis before going out Yoda style. This may or may not have left me a sobbing pile on the floor as I had just witnessed one of my favorite characters in the StarCraft 2 universe go lights out. Sometime later in the story, Kerrigan eventually goes through yet another transformation, as is on brand for her, becoming a space alien god. I mean a Xel'Naga, going Super Saiyan and wiping out Amon with a Kamehameha before vanishing for 2 years, leaving Raynor to drink his sorrows away at the end of the conflict. While Raynor is chilling in the bar, Kerrigan makes an entrance, kidnaps Raynor, and they go off to live a happily ever after in whatever space romance we just witnessed. It may sound like I'm trying to be smart here, because Sarah Kerrigan going Super Saiyan felt a bit out of place, but I won't lie, the tender moments between Raynor and Kerrigan left a lump in my throat.
These moments together, they will always be with me.
I'm not crying. You're crying. My point here is the story concluded. A lot of the major cast is gone, Zeratul is dead, Kerrigan and Raynor are off in the abyss doing space god stuff, and Blizzard ultimately delivered the narrative they wanted to tell with a cut and dry finish. Sort of. Basically, Blizzard would need to write an entire campaign from scratch and introduce a new cast of characters along with a new conflict, which isn't necessarily easy or cheap. Sure, you can argue that both Raynor and Kerrigan are still around somewhere and could make an appearance in whatever new conflict arises, but I'd argue that Blizzard would need to be careful not to make it look like a cheap trick. There's a fine balance between subtlety and the abuse of nostalgia, and I think a new cast of characters would help level things out, but they also need to make sure they aren't carbon copies of what we've already seen. Those characters need to be unique. If they're too similar to past heroes, fans might accuse Blizzard of nostalgia baiting. If they're too different, fans might reject those characters outright. It's hard to predict, and after the lukewarm reception to the Legacy of the Void's ending, Blizzard knows the story will face some scrutiny. Effectively, we would need a new campaign, new characters, and a new conflict to make StarCraft 3 a feasible project. The joy of being an owner of an IP like StarCraft is that a new story is always going to be an option. They own the title, and they have the power to craft a new narrative. The concern I have is, would they be able to create a story worth telling that didn't just feel like a ploy to capitalize on the largest RTS name in the industry? Of course, multiplayer balance and competitive play are all a concern, but let's face it, StarCraft 3 would need a narrative just as its predecessors did to have a successful launch. Now, whether or not Microsoft is willing to give the go-ahead for Blizzard to take on such a task is another question, and that brings me to my next point. The Blizzard that created StarCraft and StarCraft 2? They're gone. Blizzard in the early 90s up to the early 2000s was a completely different company compared to what they are today. They aren't even the same company. Much like Kerrigan, they went through a few phases of metamorphosis before finally becoming Activision Blizzard and eventually falling under the umbrella that is Microsoft as of 2023. To be candid, I don't know how Microsoft operates, but I do work in the corporate world, and I have to assume that Microsoft would need to greenlight any new large-scale projects like StarCraft 3. This would include some sort of project pitch, analytics, the previous models including the revenue of StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, projected revenue, the talent needed, you get what I mean. Now, regarding the talent, as I said, Blizzard from the StarCraft era doesn't really exist now. Back in 1991 when Blizzard was first founded, they were entering what was effectively a pretty clean slate in gaming. In the 90s, game development, at least from an outside perspective, felt a lot less corporate flavored. Microtransactions weren't a thing. Instead of DLCs, we had proper expansions, and in general, the perception I had at least was that game studios had a lot more freedom of choice. Of course, every studio is going to have a manager, but when the norm was to develop and release a fully finished, one-time purchase product, other companies would follow suit. Now we live in a different world, dare I say, the corpo world. And that's not to say Activision Blizzard is a bad studio or anything. Sure, they've had some misses, and I would be lying if I said that their returns to older titles were always well received, at least initially. Overwatch 2 and Warcraft Reforged come to mind here, but they've still had some successes, most notably the introduction of WoW Classic, which some reports I found estimate that around 350,000 players played on day one. If anything, this should tell Microsoft and Activision Blizzard that their classic games still hold a fan base, and let's face it, the announcement of StarCraft 3 would break the internet so hard that any gamer's algorithm would be nothing but StarCraft 3 for weeks. At the time of recording this video, even a quick glance at Twitch shows some pretty impressive numbers for Blizzard games, most notably WoW and Warcraft Reforged. I'm also confident Blizzard could get the feel and art style right, because although Diablo 4 wasn't necessarily amazing to me, I did appreciate their return to the gritty appeal and dark color palette. One thing to consider about the current state of Blizzard, though, is that they've gone through not only the Microsoft acquisition, but also a culling of some of the teams that might be best suited to work on a project like StarCraft 3. From what I could find, Team 1, who was the internal game development team responsible for the development of games like StarCraft 2 and Heroes of the Storm, was dismantled, along with the Classic Games team responsible for remastering Blizzard's old IPs. It's important to note, however, that just because a team was dismantled doesn't necessarily mean that the members who were on that team are no longer with the company. In theory, they could form a new team and bring back the old talent who worked on remastering Blizzard's legacy titles to work on StarCraft 3, or just shoot from the hip and create a new team entirely, which would be a bit of a gamble. Given how legendary the StarCraft franchise is, Blizzard would undoubtedly want to get it done right. All that said, given the fact that the sort of legacy of the Void teams were disbanded, in my opinion, it doesn't foreshadow any sort of StarCraft 3 in our near future. And it begs the question, would players even want a StarCraft 3 given the fact that it would likely be developed by a fresh team? I personally think it could be successful, but I also acknowledge it could be catastrophic. In the scenario that Microsoft deemed the project as a profitable endeavor, they would need to build a team. This would include artists, writers, developers, audio engineers, animators, a marketing team, a QA team for balance. The list goes on. To top it off, this game would follow a sort of live service model, but, at least traditionally, without a subscription. RTS games, especially in a competitive esports setting, require maintenance, mostly balance related. I would expect that a good portion of the development team could go, the marketing team could move on to other projects as well, but a core team would need to remain to work on maintenance, which costs money. And that brings us to my third point. At the end of the day, game development is a business, and when it comes to making money, RTS games just don't compare to Blizzard's other projects. Let's talk numbers. If you've made it this far in the video, I appreciate you, and I have a feeling you already know what I'm thinking. The magnum opus of Blizzard, their favorite child, World of Warcraft. If you've had any experience with this game, even without doing research, it's obvious that this is their largest cash cow. In 2022 alone, WoW brought in $792 million in revenue. Compare that to StarCraft 2, which despite being the best-selling RTS in history, brought in roughly $1 billion over its entire lifetime. And since Wings of Liberty went free to play in 2017, it's safe to say that number isn't climbing much past that. At least not for a long time. Think of it from a business perspective. What StarCraft 2 achieved in its lifetime, wow, a 21-year-old game, by the way, achieved almost 80% of that in 1 year alone. And as unfortunate for us as it is, companies like Microsoft most definitely take these kinds of metrics into account. Of course, IPs as well known as StarCraft are likely on the radar of bigwigs in the company, and I'd be shocked if the words StarCraft 3 were never thrown around in a meeting somewhere. But from Microsoft's perspective, why spend years developing an RTS game when they can make way more money focusing on titles with a higher return? Let's face it, titans like World of Warcraft bring in such an absurd amount of money that a project like StarCraft 3 just doesn't fit into that business model. And let's not forget, based on my previous points, RTS games are expensive and time-consuming to develop, balancing 3 distinct factions, creating a compelling campaign, and designing a polished multiplayer experience takes years. If the financial return isn't worth the investment, why would Blizzard prioritize it? In my opinion, Microsoft probably took one look at the revenue WoW is currently bringing in, compared it with the lifetime revenue of StarCraft, and decided the return wasn't worth the investment. To play devil's advocate here, if I were to walk into a corporate meeting preparing to pitch StarCraft, I would lead with the name. I'd argue that sitting on the largest name in RTS is like sitting on an untapped gold mine. And the name alone would sort of save you on marketing. As soon as that Blizzard logo would light up on the screen, followed by the word StarCraft 3 phasing in from the background, I'm convinced it would instantly go viral. Sure, it would be very difficult to top the numbers of WoW, but WoW isn't the only IP Blizzard has or is even working on. As a business that has the resources to diversify their projects and income streams, it's important to capitalize on the resources available to you. And the largest RTS name in the industry, I'd argue, is a very valuable resource that, if done right, could bring in the bag Microsoft has its eyes on. Now, does this mean StarCraft 3 will never happen? Not necessarily, but I wouldn't hold my breath, at least for now. If anything, we may see more uses of the IP in the more immediate future. Okay, so a lot of this is going to be speculative because obviously Blizzard has been hush-hush about whatever they've got planned for the StarCraft IP, which is the entire point of this video, and I'll be real with you guys. Based on the points made earlier in this video, I don't think Blizzard has much incentive to work on StarCraft 3 as of now. To top it off, it's been 10 years since Legacy of the Void came out, and we haven't heard so much as a peep for a potential StarCraft 3. But from what I've been able to find, there have been some rumors about a StarCraft project in development, but not in the way we might hope. And as with any rumors, we should take these with a healthy dose of skepticism. Some sources I found claim Blizzard is working on an open-world shooter set in the StarCraft universe, something more akin to Far Cry than a traditional RTS. If that's true, it would be closer to StarCraft Ghost, the canceled third-person shooter Blizzard scrapped years ago, and the more recent project, codenamed Ares, which was rumored to be more adjacent to Battlefield with a StarCraft finish, but that was canceled to make room for Overwatch 2. From what I've read, Ares made itself out to appear as a sort of hybrid between Warhammer 40k Space Marine and Battlefield, where you shoot hordes of Zerg with the option to play as Zerg being teased. If I had to guess, Blizzard would more than likely pick back up from where they left off with Ares. Presumably, they started working on some sort of framework for the game, and technologically speaking, it's probably much more modern and easier to work on, and if they had to modernize it a bit, they could probably give it a facelift much more easily than they could to StarCraft Ghost. And I'll be honest, while I was doing my research for this video, initially a StarCraft shooter didn't excite me at all. But after rewatching the StarCraft Ghost cinematic and reflecting a bit more, playing a Space Marine type of game in the StarCraft universe would be an interesting idea if it was done right. My biggest concern with any StarCraft shooter is that they would try to reskin Overwatch and they would just sell it as a new and awesome StarCraft shooter. And while I enjoy Overwatch to an extent, it feels more like I'm playing with virtual action figures than a gritty space game with hints of sci-fi horror elements like the Alien franchise. Activision Blizzard, as of now at least, doesn't really have a history of making gritty first-person shooter or third-person shooter type games. A lot of their work is more along the theme of cartoony, which just doesn't fit the StarCraft aesthetic, but as I said earlier in this video, their return to grit in Diablo 4 at the very least tells me that they know how to develop games in that style, and StarCraft hasn't, as of yet, regressed to the cartoony style like we saw in Diablo 3. But again, we need to take these rumors with a huge grain of salt, and we have to consider the fact that Blizzard has already canceled 2 StarCraft shooters in the past, so this next rumored StarCraft shooter would be their third attempt attempt at an FPS StarCraft game. As far as I'm concerned, attempts at a StarCraft shooter are cursed, but even so, I have some hope. If anything, a hopefully popular non-RTS StarCraft game might even pave the way for StarCraft 3 with reignited interest from the community and incentive for Activision Blizzard. The way I see it, StarCraft is one of Blizzard's biggest and most beloved franchises. It's hard to imagine them leaving it untouched forever. Whether it takes 5 years or another decade, we'll probably see StarCraft 3 eventually, but as it stands now, I just don't think Microsoft or Activision Blizzard have the financial incentive to make another RTS for a while. And making a StarCraft-flavored shooter might be their way of dipping their toes back in the water. So what do you think? Will we ever see StarCraft 3? Did I completely miss the mark? What do you think the future holds for StarCraft? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell for more gaming content, and I'll see you guys on the next one.